So we're going to start our discussion of angles. So first of all, what is an angle? I want you to imagine an arrow pointing in a certain direction. This arrow will be anchored at the left side where I drew that point, and then we imagine rotating the arrow about that point. So we rotate it a bit, and then the arrow ends up pointing a different direction. So the amount we rotated it, we're going to call that an angle. Okay, the amount that you need to rotate to get from one direction to a different direction. So how do we measure angles? Well, there's different ways we can talk about how large or how small an angle is. The first basic way is the number of rotations. Okay, we can talk about the number of full rotations as a measure of how much something turned. So if I have an arrow and then I rotate it an entire circle, so I rotate it all the way around and it ends up back exactly where it started, I kind of did one full rotation. Okay, so one rotation would be the measure of that angle. But then maybe I don't want to rotate it all the way. Maybe I only want to rotate it until it points to the direct opposite direction. Okay, so that would be considered half a rotation, or 0.5 rotations if you like decimals better. But I'll stick with fractions for now. Or I can rotate it less than that. So another common rotation, let me start with one arrow. I can rotate it until it points up here. You can think of a compass. If we start pointing east and we rotate it until we're pointing north, that would be 1/4 of a full rotation. So 1/4 of a rotation, or 0.25 if you want decimals. Similarly, we can rotate 3/4 of a rotation. Okay, so if we're facing the east and we rotate counterclockwise all the way until we face the south, that's 3/4 of a rotation. And those are some of the common ones, but we can kind of go in between too. So if we take, let's say we take a 90-degree angle. So here I've drawn a 1/4 of rotation. So that's 1/4 of it. Well, what's half of a quarter? So I can take that quarter rotation, but only go halfway. And a half of a quarter, that's actually like 1/8 of a rotation. Okay, so we can define one rotation as being the full circle all the way around, and then we just ask what fraction of a full rotation we have turned. So that's one way to measure angles, but that's not the usual way to measure angles. The more common way to measure angles is using degrees. Okay, and I slipped up earlier. I mentioned 90 degrees, so I've already used the word before introducing it to you, but I'm going to introduce it to you now. So degrees is a common unit of measurement for angles. And the way it's defined, there's a couple ways to think about it. 1 degree, and by the way, that little tiny circle at the top right of the number, that's the symbol for degrees. 1 degree is actually equivalent to 1 out of 360 of a rotation. So you think of a full circle rotation, you split it up into 360 equal turns. And now those turns are very, very tiny because it takes 360 of them before you fit one full rotation. And that small amount of turning, that small amount of rotating is considered 1 degrees. That's one way to think of it. Or another way to think of it is 360 degrees will be 1 full rotation. Okay, so I'm going to draw some degrees out now. So again, if you start pointing one way and you rotate the full way around the whole circle, we're now using degrees. We're going to call that 360 degrees. That's the measure of that angle. That's the measure of that amount of turning. Now, if I have like the corner of a box, I drew looks like the corner of a box, and we ask how much rotation is in between the two lines there. How much do I have to turn to get from one to the other? Well, that's a quarter of a rotation. Okay, you can visualize it as 1/4 of a rotation. But now we can think of it as a quarter of 360 degrees. Take 360 divided by 4. That ends up equaling 90 degrees. So the corner of a box, the angle between the two walls there is 90 degrees. That's a common angle. And actually, if we have 90 degrees, we have a special symbol for 90 degrees. Instead of drawing a little curve to state the angle, we actually use this kind of box shape. And this represents, that symbol represents 90 degrees. Okay, what about a half of a turn? So we start pointing one way, and then we rotate it half a turn until we point the exact opposite way. How many degrees is that? Well, if a full turn is 360 degrees, then half of it would be half of that. So half of 360 degrees turns out to be 180 degrees. And if we take this 90-degree angle, and now we cut it in half, okay, we cut that 90-degree angle in half, how much is half of the 90-degree rotation? Well, half of 90 is 45 degrees. And I'll label the other half as well, another 45 degrees. Okay, so those are some common measures in degrees. There are some more common ones as well. So if I take a 90-degree angle again, okay, here's a 90-degree angle. This time I'm going to split it into 3 equal parts. Well, I did my best to split that 90-degree into 3 equal parts. There's 1, there's 2, there's 3. So how many degrees is each of those angles? Well, 90 divided by 3 makes 30 degrees. Okay, so 30-degree angles are pretty common in high school math as well. And so are 60-degree angles. So I'll draw in blue. If you add up 2 30-degree angles, then the blue makes a 60-degree angle. Okay, those are pretty common. And how about one more? So I drew an arrow. I'm just drawing some reference lines here. And I'm going to use, I guess I'll use yellow. So if we rotate to 90, but then we pass it, we pass 90 until we go halfway in between the next 90. How much is that turn I just drew in yellow? So it's more than 90, but it's not quite 180. It's actually halfway between 90 and 180. So if 90 degrees would be up there, 180 degrees would be to the left there. I've landed exactly halfway in between there. So what's the exact halfway point between 90 and 180? Well, it turns out to be like half of 90 is 45. So if I add together the original 90 and I add another 45, the total amount is 135 degrees. Actually, I need to do one more important one. What does 1 degree look like? What does 1 degree look like? So 1 degree is hard to draw. You have to imagine a full circle. Imagine a full circle, but take that full circle and split it up into 360 equal parts. So each part turns out to be really small. So 1 degree, imagine drawing it so small that it takes 360 of them before I make a full circle. What I drew there is probably too big. It's probably more than 1 degree. I'm going to try to make it a bit smaller. Okay, so really small, okay? That's probably not correct. But if you want to be accurate to draw one, we use a tool called a protractor. And I didn't download a picture of a protractor, but maybe you've seen one before. But we may use them in class. And you can use that tool to draw really accurate angles. Okay, so there's an introduction on what angles are and how we measure them in degrees. Actually, not quite done. Forgot about a few important words here. If an angle is smaller than 90 degrees, so I'm going to use this less than sign. Or let's not, here. Acute angles are less than 90 degrees. So if you have something smaller than 90 degrees, we give it a name acute. So I'll draw a few. So this angle right here, that's definitely smaller than 90. Remember, 90 degrees is like the corner of a box, so that's smaller than a corner of a box. If you have a perfectly 90-degree angle, we have a special name for that. We call it a right angle. So a right angle is equal exactly to 90 degrees. So I'll draw the corner of a box, and we use that special symbol to indicate 90 degrees. Now, what if your angle is larger than 90 degrees? We call that an obtuse angle. It's got to be larger than 90 degrees, but at the same time, it has to be less than 180. Okay, so I'm just going to say between 90 degrees and 180 degrees. And we call those obtuse angles. So I'll draw one. So something like this. It's more than 90, but it's less than a straight line. So that's obtuse, and I've already given away the next one. Straight angle is a word we use for exactly 180 degrees. So if we have a straight line, and we imagine turning around the entire straight line, that's 180 degrees. That's a straight angle. And then we'll have something called a reflex angle. And that's going to be larger than 180, but less than 360. So I'm going to say between 180 degrees and 360 degrees. So a reflex angle, you go all the way around past past 180, and then you get to a reflex angle. And finally, we're gonna call full rotation as 360 degrees. And we've already talked about the word full rotation before, so I won't draw that out. Okay, so yeah, now we are ready to end the video on an intro to angles.